All right. Good afternoon and good day, everybody. Looks like it is 2 o'clock Central Time where we reside, 3 o'clock Eastern. And if you're joining us in a recording, then the time is the time you're watching this. Thank you so much for taking some time out to join us and learn a little bit about accessibility in Microsoft PowerPoint. My name is Rob Carr. I am the Information and Communication Technology Accessibility Program Manager for Oklahoma Able Tech. We are Oklahoma's Assistive Technology Act program, and we serve a lot of folks all across the state to help with accessibility in all kinds of different things. We're really pleased to be able to bring this to you today. This is a partnership between Able Tech and our National Technical Assistance Group, which is the AT3 Center, and I want to thank them for their support in running this today and getting everything going with Zoom. So we are, there's no we are. I just want to add, as you have questions, please feel free to type those as they pop in mind. There's no reason to wait until the end. I'm not going to hold time for questions at the end necessarily. Please use the chat window for your questions. That's going to be the first place that we will look. So if you have a question, just pop it into the chat. My colleague and coworker, Lissa, will be monitoring the chat, as will I. And so we should be able to field questions as they come in. I see a question about dialing in. Is anybody having trouble with the telephone? Of course, if you're having trouble with the telephone and that's your audio, you can't hear me. We'll proceed and we'll see if we can't help out a little bit for our one caller trying to join us. Dawn, thank you for confirming that it is working for someone. So that's just helpful to know that somebody did make it in. Okay, let's take some steps toward more inclusive and accessible presentations. So I would say that this is your cheat sheet for the day. These are the things that you can Google later on. And these are also things that you'll find in a resource that I will give you at the end that will help quite a bit as follow-up, or if there's something that you just don't use for a little while, I have some links and resources. We'll also put them in the chat when the time comes. But we're going to go through these things today specifically. I'm going to talk a fair amount about using the Slide Master, which a lot of you may use. I find that a lot of folks don't know it exists. So we'll talk a fair amount about using Slide Master, and that's to make it more efficient to create and use accessible themes and slide layouts. We'll talk about how PowerPoint manages reading order, and I'll describe that more once we get to some demonstration time here in a little bit. I'm going to talk a bit about slide titles, and the first point is to use unique slide titles for each slide. And the second has to do with hiding slide titles visibly in the right way. Then we'll move and talk about text equivalents. These will be for visuals that you have, so images, charts, graphs, things like that. And I will get out my color soapbox and talk a little bit about color contrast and color use, both. The next few things that we'll talk about are making sure that link text is useful and descriptive. And much more quickly, I'm going to talk about audio and video considerations, talk a little bit about considerations with animation, talk a little bit about speaker notes, and assuming we have time and I don't get too long-winded about something, I'll give you just a couple of pointers about how you actually deliver the content, whether it's a webinar like this or if you're in a room with folks or both. I'll try to leave you with some pointers about how to make your actual presentation a little bit more inclusive as well. So I want to start by talking about themes and layouts, because I'm going to use these words quite a bit. In PowerPoint, a theme you can think of as the overall design for a set of slides. I'll show you where these things are in PowerPoint here in just a couple of minutes, but you get to see all of the available themes through the Design tab. And among other things, a theme will define all of the colors for different content. So for example, a theme will define your regular font color, your link text color, your followed link text color. It'll define different layouts. There will be a set of individual layouts within a theme. And it's nice, and we use themes quite a bit at AbleTech because we have multiple projects that we work on. Some are under the AbleTech banner, some are in partnership with other folks. And so we have multiple themes that we will use just based on the contract or the work that we're doing. They're pretty easy to customize, and I'm gonna make a case that using themes and playing with themes in the slide master gets you a lot of efficiency when you're talking about building slides in general, and certainly when it comes to accessibility specifically. So within each theme, you will have a number of different slide layouts. The layouts are the individual designs. So you'll have a layout like this one on screen. This is just a title up at the top with a content panel in the middle. And in this case, I just have text. But as we'll see when we get into demonstration here in a couple of minutes, there's actually a lot of different kinds of content I can put in here. So to get to the layouts, it comes up automatically when you add a new slide if you use the ribbon to do that, and I'll show you this here in just a couple of minutes. And there are a few different ways to see these different layouts. There are several built in to themes that you use that are either available online through Microsoft or that are built into your installed version of PowerPoint. And again, they're pretty easy to go in and edit or change or add in the slide master view. So just some nomenclature to get us started. The slide master that I mentioned has really become my go-to place for building new slide layouts. In other words, I don't typically go in and build a slide one by one. I don't start with a blank slide and add everything in. I do most of my layout and editing to the layouts in Slide Master. That's me. I know a lot of folks tend to want to build everything by hand, and I would suggest that you can still do that in Slide Master. The biggest advantage is that after you build a slide layout, you'll be able to reuse it later. But in Slide Master, you're going in and directly editing the design theme and the individual layouts. You can do things like manage the content reading order. You can move and manipulate content placeholders. And as I said, you can create new layouts that you can go in and pick from later whenever you use that particular theme. So without any further ado, I'm actually going to jump out of the presentation view in PowerPoint. And for most of the rest of the time, I'm going to go through these things and demonstrate and talk through them as we go. So that list that I read off before, ironically enough, to teach PowerPoint, I'm not going to show you a bunch of slides. I'm just going to go in and build some slides out. So on screen now, you should be seeing just PowerPoint, not the PowerPoint slideshow. If you're still seeing the slideshow, please let me know in the chat. Or how about if you're seeing actual PowerPoint, let me know in the chat. And that way I will know that, hey, this is actually working. Otherwise, I'm going to continue to talk as if everything is going splendidly. Thank you for confirming. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the Slide Master view. So you get to Slide Master by changing the view. And to do that, conveniently, there is a tab up near the top of the window labeled simply View. So I'm going to open up the View tab. And I have several different options. I'm going to focus on the option that is visibly located at the top left in the ribbon. It's maybe 1/8 of the way across from the left. I've got a group labeled Master Views. And within this, I have an option that's labeled Slide Master. So I am going to click on, or you can do this with your keyboard shortcuts for Office, you can open up the Slide Master view. The view in Slide Master is really similar to the view when you are building individual slides in PowerPoint. You have off at the left some thumbnails that show you the little tiny versions of the slides. And then in the center of the content, you have the slide itself. The biggest difference here is that we're looking at slide layouts in our main content area. So we're not looking at the individual slides that will project up on a screen. We're looking at the layouts that slides are based on. So when I talked about themes and layouts before, basically we're editing the theme and the layouts here. So there are a few really nice things about doing this. Like I said, number one and chief for me is efficiency. I can build a slide layout, I can change a layout, and I can reuse that layout over and over again. I can also come in here and change the layout, and any slide that uses that layout will also change. So I don't have to always go through and make changes slide by slide. I can do several all at one time. The other nice thing about it is any accessibility that I build into the slide layouts is going to be there built in when I use the layout in an actual slide deck. And that's a key. So I'm going to move to some specifics about accessibility that I can do here in the Slide Master view. And I want you to understand that you can use most of these tools when you're editing individual slides as well. So questions about, before I move on, any questions in particular about themes, layouts, or what we're actually working with here in this Slide Master view? So and if you want to type a question in, feel free to do that as I move on. So each one of these, again, is a layout. I'm using a mouse, and so I'm going to be mouse driven here this afternoon, or again, today, if you're watching this in a recording at a different time of day. One of the things that is handy about this Slide Master view is that as I run my mouse pointer over each of the thumbnails for these different layouts, it shows me the name of the layout. Each layout has a name that makes it easy to identify. And it also tells me which slides the layout actually uses. The majority of this deck uses this same layout, which is just called title and content layout. So I want to do a couple of things here. With this particular layout, I want to add another content placeholder. So in other words, right now I have title at the top, and I have a placeholder that will let me put in text or images or tables and so on and so on. So I want to add another content chunk to this slide layout. And remember that whatever I change here will change every slide that uses this layout in the presentation. And I'll show you the result of that here in just a moment. So I'm going to jump in, and you can use the skills that you probably already have in PowerPoint to do something like this if you want to follow along. I'm just going to make this content box a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it about half of the width that it is now. And I am going to push it, as I do this, as I make it smaller, I'm going to leave it off to the right just a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is add another content placeholder. One of the things that I like about using Slide Master is that instead of adding a text box or an image specifically, you can come in and insert just a general placeholder. So you have all the flexibility in the world to put in text or images or a video or chart, whatever you'd like to put in. And to do that, when I'm in Slide Master, the Slide Master tab is automatically selected, and I have a menu with a few options. And I'm just going to focus right now on the option that, again, is a little bit in from the left-hand side, and it says Insert Placeholder. I've got a little down arrow that tells me that if I click on this, it will give me some options. And the options are content, text, picture, chart, etc. This might just be me being lazy, but I always just grab a content placeholder. And once I've selected that, I've got some little crosshairs that I can use to draw this out. So I'm just going to draw this visibly left-hand side. It's going to largely mirror the one that I just moved off to the right. So I'm not going to get too into specific formatting here. This is formatted slightly differently than the existing. There are all kinds of options now that it shows me in the Format tab to change my text orientation and so on and so forth. For our purposes, this is to show, one, I have changed every single slide that uses this layout. So I'm going to change out of Slide Master real quick, which I do by going over to the Slide Master tab, and I look for an option that's just about in the middle of my screen that says Close Master View. So I'm going to close out of this, and now when I look at these slides, remember it was like slide 2 through 13, use this layout, all of the content is off to the right now, because I changed the position of those content windows on this layout. So I wanted to do this to show you that a change in one place changes the whole deck. So there's a lot of the efficiency. So where does the accessibility come in, you're asking? Well, I'm going to go back in to my view. I'm going to open Slide Master up. And I'm going to check the reading order of this slide. So I mentioned reading order a couple of times before, and that might be kind of a foreign concept. In Microsoft, and this is true in Word, it's, I think, a bigger issue usually in PowerPoint. You can actually have a disconnect between the reading order of a visible slide. In other words, reading left to right, top to bottom visibly. You can have a break between that visible reading order and the reading order that is announced by a screen reader or a braille display, for example. And that reading order is something that in PowerPoint you can manage. And there's a little bit of background to this. This requires a certain degree of maturity, I will say. Those of us of a certain age remember when we had overhead projectors, and you might still have overhead projectors. If you're in K-12, you probably do somewhere. But we had overhead projectors, and you had the individual blank transparencies that you would set on a projector, and whatever was there would project up through the overhead. Well, PowerPoint slides are kind of built with transparencies. They're built in different different layers. So this slide that I'm looking at in Master View, one layer has the title that's up at the top. Another layer has the content pane on the right-hand side. Another layer has the one on the left, and so on and so forth. The reading order that Microsoft provides to assistive technologies uses these layers to define the reading order. So it's a little bit odd maybe at first to think about it that way, because when you see these content chunks, they're separate, they're distinct. You can't tell that they're layered, but structurally, they're just layers, one on top of the other. So when we talk about reading order, what we're really talking about is the order that those layers exist in. So to get into the reading order, and this is true whether you're in Slide Master View or you're editing individual slides, in order to see the reading order, you're going to go into the Home tab. So then you'll move over kind of to the right field of vision, and you're looking for a button that is labeled Arrange. It's in the drawing group, again, off to the right, depending on your screen resolution. It could be more toward the center. I'm going to click on the Arrange button, and down at the very bottom, I have an option called Selection Pane. So this is where you can actually see the order of these different layers. There are some other layers in this slide that I'm not going to worry about quite as much. But the most important thing to remember with reading order is that the reading order in this list, in this selection pane, actually begins at the bottom of the list. I think that's one of the most confusing things about PowerPoint accessibility, is that you have to look down the list and read from the bottom to the top. Now, you can actually see visibly the reading order if you click on the title. In this case, the lowest thing on my list is labeled Title 1. And if I click on that, visibly it highlights it off to the left-hand side. So I'm going to move through these, and I'm going to look at the content placeholders. That's what I'm most concerned about, because I added a second content placeholder to this particular slide. So Title 1 is at the very bottom. The next one up from it is Content Placeholder 2. That's just the generic name for that content placeholder. So I'm going to click on Content Placeholder 2, and it's this one that's off to the right-hand side visibly. So that's a little strange. In terms of the visible reading order, we'd expect to read the title and then whatever content is in the content placeholder on the left-hand side. But in this case, that's not working out that way. And in fact, I have to go all the way up to the top of this list, which is actually the last thing in the reading order, to see Content Placeholder 7. So I'm going to click on Content Placeholder 7, and that's the generic name for this placeholder that I added. That really should be the thing that's read after the title. So once you kind of get used to going from the bottom to the top in this list, you'll get to where fixing reading order is relatively straightforward. Because all I need to do is grab this content placeholder 7, and I can do this with my mouse and click and drag it down, or I can use the up or down arrows that are just in the upper right of the selection pane. And all I need to do is move this thing into the correct order. And again, that's going to be, in this case, right after the title. So I'm going to select content placeholder 7, and I'm just going to click on the down arrow until it is right above title 1. So now when I click on title 1, okay, there's my title. That's the first thing that I want read. When I click on the next thing up in the list, it's content placeholder 7, but it's the right content placeholder. It's the correct one. So now, because of that important change, this content will be read in the right order. Angela, I see your question. I will get to the I, and I will just ask you, there's a question about what does the I icon mean? Because in each one of these, if you can't see the screen, to the right of each content placeholder, there's a little icon that looks like an I. Angela, I would just ask, what version of PowerPoint do you have? And I'll get back to what the I does here in just a few minutes. So again, it's really important to remember that even when you're not in Slide Master View, you can and should check the reading order of your slides, especially if you go in and add text boxes or you do some one-off edits to slides. Remember, you're just piling those things in layers and they're all going to go in on top of one another, probably after the stuff that's already there. So reading order errors are really, really common in PowerPoint files, and that error will affect the reading order in a PDF that you create from the slides. So it's not something that fixes without you going in here and fixing it in the selection pane. So I'm going to hop back into Slide Master. And I'm actually going to get rid of this little bit that I added. And I want to see what questions y'all have about reading order, either the concept or actually going in and fixing it. And I don't see any coming in, but we'll keep an eye on the chat. Really important thing to do to make sure, again, that the reading order is correct. And the efficiency gain in doing this in slide sorter is that if you fix it here, as long as you don't change anything slide by slide, it'll be fixed with the layout that you use. So there's a question about the I, and I'm going to talk about slide titles here real quickly. I'm going to close out of Slide Master View, and I'm going to hop into one of the slides that I just used. So the content isn't important. We're going to take a look at the slide title and how to actually hide a slide title visibly if you don't want a visible title on a slide. So the first point that I want to make about slide titles is that every slide should have one, and they should all be unique. A lot of folks will actually access the content in your slides by taking a look at the outline view. And even in terms of navigating through the slides, every slide title becomes a navigation point for people that use screen reading software, that use Braille displays. So when a slide doesn't have a title, it can be disorienting because there's not an easy way to tell when the content transitions from one to the next necessarily. So in order to keep that from breaking and in order to keep that interaction consistent and understandable, you want every slide to have a title. And everyone should be unique. And I'll give you an example because I think this happens pretty often. I had slides earlier where I had a list that has about 10 things in it about 10 things in it in all, and I split that list up across 2 slides. So my slide title for the first is just a few keys. There's about a few key themes and elements in PowerPoint. And the continuation just says a few more keys. So I'm not averse to people putting, part 1, part 2, or continued on slides. It's just a really good habit to get into to make each slide unique. So now we've covered that every slide needs a title. Every title needs to be unique. There are times that are legitimate when, even with all that, you don't want the slide title to show up because visibly it doesn't need a title. Maybe you have an image that you're going to focus on and describe and talk about during your presentation or during your class. So you don't need a visible title there. You can hide the slide title, but keep it in place. Not skip it, not type it in and delete it, not delete the title placeholder. You can actually just hide it visibly. And you do that in the selection pane, which is already opened up on my screen. Again, that's where I can see the reading order. And as Angela noted, there is an icon that looks like a little eye off to the right of each one of the content placeholders on this slide. In order to hide the title, or in order to hide any of the content, I just click on the little eye icon. And when I click on that, it looks like the eye closes. It goes from kind of an open eye with a pupil to just a line. And the title disappears from my slide visibly. So it's still there, it's just hidden. And that's what we're going for with slide titles. So that way we can stick by the notions of having a title on each one and making sure they're unique, but we can still hide it. So quick tip, relatively easy, really helpful. We see a lot of slide decks that don't have titles on every slide, and it does make it a lot more difficult to navigate through, especially if you're in a PDF. Depending on how you convert your PowerPoint into PDF, it can be a little bit more disorienting, but it's still a little jarring for slides not to have titles one way or the other, regardless of whether someone's navigating through PowerPoint or navigating through a PDF. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about text equivalence for visuals. Many of you, I'm sure, use visuals to add to your presentations. I know I do. I've gotten to where I have a few talks that are more kind of a story. I mean, they're teaching, but it's not as hands-on how-to as this is. And so to add an image to a slide can bring quite a bit. You know, can add a lot of content to your presentation and to your teaching. And in some cases, it's just flat out necessary. Whenever you add a visual, you've got to be sure that there is a text equivalent for it. And that's, again, so if someone is using a screen reader, they will hear the intended meaning of that visual. And a lot of the time, this is a really simple thing to do. I have a blank slide. I'm not going to worry too much about the slide title right now. I'm going to demonstrate inserting alternative text into an image. So text equivalents in general are a relatively broad concept. The idea, again, is to provide a text snippet that provides the equivalent meaning for an image. The image that I inserted here is somebody having a sign language, an American Sign Language conversation using a tablet. I don't know if it's FaceTime, I'm not sure which app, but this image just shows that's actually 3 people having an ASL conversation. And so I could use this potentially in a few different ways, right? It could be that the important thing of this image is using a tablet as assistive technology, right? For those of you who do AT work, we've seen how many quote unquote mainstream technologies have really helped to provide better access to assistive technology because they are just built into the devices. And things like FaceTime are a pretty good example of that. So instead of having to have specialized equipment, this picture might be showing with a tablet, you don't necessarily need the specialized equipment. It could be, though, that I'm using this image in the context of sign language specifically. So I might just be making some kind of a point about sign language being a visual communication method that uses symbology as opposed to speech. So the same image I might use in different ways. And that's really important when it comes to thinking about your text equivalence, because your text equivalent is almost always going to be based on the context that you use your image in. So that's the general thing about your text equivalence. The text equivalent, that broad category, again, most of the time, there's going to be a little place where you can put it that tucks it in behind the image, associates it with the image, and makes that text available for screen readers. It won't be visible, and unless somebody knows where to go to see it, they're not going to ever know that it's there. It's critically important that it's there, though. It really has to be there on images. And there's an important thing that I want to note about where I go to add this in this version of PowerPoint, and that is I'm on PowerPoint 2019. If you're on an older version, you've got to right-click and go through some submenus to find this. If you're on 2019, then when you insert your image or click on the image or select it, you automatically either automatically open up a format tab, or there's a format tab that appears up in the ribbon that you can get to. And again, in Office 2019, there is a button that on my screen is a little bit off to the right in the ribbon. It's in a group of one. The group's labeled Accessibility, and there's a button that says Alt Text. And I'm going to click on that button, and it's going to open up another little sidebar panel that's labeled Alt Text. And I think it asks a pretty good question. It says, how would you describe this object and its context to someone who is blind? The way that I've tried to help people think about the text equivalents in alt text is to think about what you would say if you were reading the slide deck to somebody. You know, if you were, on the phone, excuse me. So if you're just reading it aloud on a telephone, what do you say when you get to the visual, when you get to that image? And that's what you want to put into your alternative text. There's an interesting thing about Office 2019 that's brand new to Office 2019. It's happening in some Google Suite stuff. It's happening on Facebook. And that is that this alt text box is automatically generated. There's text there already. And it's nice that it has a note. There's a note that says description automatically generated because, and I'll read the text here in just a moment, the text that it generates may miss the mark completely. So my suggestion with the automatic alt text is to check it, more than likely just clear all the text out and type your own. Again, so this is an image of people having a conversation using their hands through a tablet, and the text that it generated says, a picture containing person, outdoor, grass, holding. That's not it at all, not in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to highlight all of this text. I'm going to delete it. And what you can do here is just type in your snippet of text. So I'm just going to type in people having a sign language conversation on a tablet. And that's all there is to it. Once you type that in there, you close the menu, it's saved. Again, it's tucked in back behind the image. It's there waiting for assistive technology to look for, find, and then announce it or convert it to Braille on a Braille display. A relatively small thing, hugely, hugely important. You know, I say it's a relatively small thing because for us as authors, it should be a relatively small thing. There is a new option also in 2019 that is really helpful, and that is you can mark an image as decorative. And this little box down at the bottom of my alt text pane is just labeled mark as decorative. What that does when you check on that box, you hide the image from assistive technology, and you only do this if the image is purely decorative, it's eye candy, it doesn't convey any actual meaning. And I think in PowerPoint more than maybe in Word, you're liable to have images that don't really mean anything. They are there just to look nice. And that's okay. I mean, there are some PowerPoint, you know, kind of common sense and other rules that would say that you don't want those to take away from your presentation. The point is that especially in this latest version, if you have a decorative image, you have the option to hide it from assistive technology. You're only going to do this if, as you think about maybe reading this over the telephone, when you get to the image, you don't have anything to say. It'll hide it completely here in PowerPoint, and it will hide it in PDF as well, if you click on Mark as Decorative. So I got a question here about alt text in general that says, would you add that it is an image? You don't need to do that. The screen reader will recognize that it's an image already. So that information doesn't need to come through in your text equivalent. It's just redundant at that point. Now, it could be that there are some things that are meaningful in that. So let's say, for example, you have a piece of art from a photography exhibit. Well, there it might be meaningful to say that it's a photograph because it's in a photography exhibit. But that's one of the, I don't want to say tricky, some of the nuance in writing text equivalents is figuring out what is meaningful. But your question about do we need to say that it's an image? You don't. That just adds overhead. And with that in mind, alt text, generally speaking, should be as concise as possible. In PowerPoint presentations, you don't tend to have outrageously complex images that don't have, maybe along with a pretty chart, some data in a table. You know, you might have both of those things in your slides. Generally speaking, you don't have outrageously complex images that need super long descriptions. If you're sitting there or standing there and you're rolling your eyes because I just said that, then you can also consider adding a longer description into the notes that are down at the bottom, the speaker's notes. Speaker's notes in PowerPoint are accessible. They're keyboard available, which means somebody using a screen reader can get there, and they're read pretty well by a screen reader. In that case, I would actually use the alt text specifically to say the description is in the speaker notes so that somebody knows where to look for it. Normally, my advice would be to just type that up and have it, you know, in text close to the picture. But for PowerPoint, it's not really how it works. That's not how we use it. But we still want that longer description if it's needed, and that's not a bad place to put it. Other questions on text equivalents for images? Okay, now I'm going to hop on a soapbox and I'm going to talk a little bit about color. The first point I want to make is going to be just about color contrast. And I will say that in PowerPoint, this is super important, y'all. I think every single one of us has been to a class or a conference talk somewhere, and we have looked up and they have had text. I'm just going to type a phrase. I'm just going to type, this should be easier to read. And right now it's dark blue on a white. The contrast is relatively high. I'm going to change this font color real quick. My default is usually a light gray, but I'm going to go with yellow. So I've got now yellow on white, which is ridiculously hard to read. It's even worse by the time it goes out to whatever random projector is in a room and becomes effectively white on white. When we talk about color contrast, we're talking about specifically the difference in brightness between a font color and a background color. So with this bright yellow on bright white, the contrast is super, super low. Color contrast is outrageously important just in general in visible design, whether it's web pages or Word documents. PowerPoint, you're really working against yourself if your color contrast is poor. And as we work with folks all over the place in all these different file formats, including PowerPoint, I'm going to say that there aren't very many that we look at if someone says, could you check this for accessibility, where we don't come back and say, you've got some problems with color contrast. People, I don't want to say get too creative, people just don't think about color contrast, or it looks pretty good on their screen, and then they really notice it when they get to the room they're teaching or presenting in, and it's really difficult to read. So the accessibility standards actually give us a ratio of brightness from the font to the background that you want to stay above to meet the mark. In PowerPoint, I will highly suggest that you just keep your text sharply contrasted with the background colors. You know, light and dark, contrast those all the time. If it's borderline, it could still be really difficult to read. The nice thing about Office 2019, other than making alt text easier to get to, is that there's a built-in feature in the accessibility checker, which will check color contrast. So when I run that here a little bit later, I'm going to leave this yellow here, just so it will show the fail. The other piece that we see pretty frequently, and maybe even more frequently, is the way that people use color. So I've used this example before. I think it's a straightforward example that does really illustrate the challenges here. So this is a bar chart, or a line graph, excuse me. I've got 3 lines, series 1, 2, and 3, and color is used to distinguish one from the other. So series 1 is blue, 2 is red, 3 is green. For those of you who have not heard me harp on color use before, tell me what's wrong with this. What's a potential problem in the way that this is presented visibly? And you can just type thoughts into the chat. Christina says if you have color blindness, you can't differentiate the lines. Right. So in this case, this hits on red-green color blindness, and you're just going to see those two as basically the same color. The same is true if you print your slides out on a black and white printer. Everything is just going to be washed out to grayscale. You won't be able to tell the difference from one to the next. This I see a lot. You know, in presentations, I see this a lot. Somebody points out as well that the key is pretty small. And so it could be difficult to tell the line colors just based on the size of the key. I think that's a fair point as well. So again, we see this a bunch. I go to accessibility and assistive technology conferences and still see it. It's just something that people don't really think about. You can manipulate your charts, and we're not going to get into how to do that. It's just very important if you have charts, graphs, and even if you use text, you use text color to differentiate information. You want to be sure that you're adding something in addition to the color. So my point isn't to say don't use color, because for a lot of your audience, it's going to be really helpful. You just need to add something else. So I'm going to get rid of this one and add in the same information. It's just presented now with what they call markers. So the blue line that represents series 1 has triangles along it. The red line has diamonds along it, and the green line has squares. So whether it's in the key or in the chart or graph itself, now I can tell the difference between those, even if I can't perceive the color difference. Really, really important. I emphasize it the way I do because, again, you go to conferences, you see it all the time. You see bar charts and pie charts and stacked bar charts that use color to convey very important information, and it's not up there. Nicole, you ask, how do you add the markers? I'll give you a preview. I won't go in and do it directly, but if you right-click in your chart, we'll see if actually I think this is just a picture. Yeah, this is just a JPEG. If you do a right-click on your chart, so the first thing is you need to build the chart from a data set. And so if you just follow the chart wizard in PowerPoint, it'll take you through all of that stuff. There are options in there to add markers. There are options if you use a pie chart to put the labels next to the slices of pie instead of off to the side. And so you just want to pay attention to some of those not really hidden, also not obvious settings that you can use when you go in and build the chart or graph out. Again, if you're talking about color just in text, then it's a matter of not only using color, adding a different format, a different visible format to the text. So I will stop now. I could probably rant about color for an hour, but it gets to a point where it's not constructive anymore. Really, really important though, for those of us that use something that so many people will rely on visually to make sure that our visuals are actually meaningful and visible and perceivable. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, this is a quick one. If you have links in your slides, they're really, really helpful. And actually, I will just show you, I'll skip ahead a little bit, and I'll show you my resources slide. So the idea of links, whether it's PowerPoint or web, is that you give people some stuff they can go check out outside of wherever you are. So in a PowerPoint slide, I've got these actually just 4 links, but I have 8 lines of information here. And that's because we need to be sure that when you type out a link that's clickable or that's followable through the enter key, the actual link itself has a descriptive bit of text, and it's not just a website address. So I've got 4 resources here, and this is really, really clear. When you look at it or your screen reader announces it, it's going to say, and you're going to read World Wide Web Consortium on Accessible Presentations. The second one is WebAIM on Accessible PowerPoint. The third is Microsoft on Accessible PowerPoint. And the fourth is a color contrast tool that is really helpful if you're on an older version of Office. And again, this is linked, and I'll put the links in the chat when we get here a little bit later. With each one of these, though, the underlined clicky part, the link that you'd actually follow, is those bits of text. Now, with PowerPoint and with Word and PDF, with documents that might be printed, this kind of poses a challenge, because if all you have in your link is text and somebody has a paper copy of that, then they don't know what the website address is. They can't follow it, they can't copy and paste it if it's not digital. So my advice in that case is to still make the clicky part, if you will, to the active link, to still make that descriptive. And then what I've done here is I've just put in regular text, not linked, a website address. I used a website address shortener. I use bit.ly to shorten these, but this gives somebody something that they can look at on a piece of paper and type into a web browser. On the web, we don't make this suggestion, but when we get to things that might be printed out, you know, again, your PowerPoints and Word documents and PDFs, we will suggest to go ahead and add the visible website address itself. So there's a myriad of reasons that you want to have the link text be descriptive. One is that if someone's using a screen reader, they can literally have the reader put together a list of all the links on a page. And so you can imagine if the links are the website addresses, that can just kind of be junk. If the links are descriptive, then someone knows what's going to happen when they actually follow it. So in the properties, I'm going to hop into link properties real quickly and show you where you can manage this stuff. So I'm just going to click in any one of these links. I'm going to do a right click. I think the context menu is what, Shift F8, Shift F10. But I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to go down into my option that says Edit Link. And this is also the window that you'll get if you add a link. Up at the very top, you have a text box that's labeled with the text to display. And that's going to be the link text, and that's what you want to be descriptive. Then the website address you can put in down at the bottom of this window. Now, what a lot of people have learned is if you need to tell people more about what the link does or where it goes, you can use a screen tip. And a screen tip is the thing that if you run your mouse pointer over a link, it'll pop up a little bit of extra text, a little bit of extra help. Well, screen tips aren't accessible via keyboard unless they've changed that in Office 2019. So it makes a lot more sense to me to just put the information about the link in text to display, have the web address embedded in it, and leave it at that. If your link text is descriptive, you don't need a screen tip. So quick and easy, very helpful. And somebody asked earlier about the image, and if you need to say it's an image, screen readers will announce that the clicky part that we've made a link is a link. And in fact, it'll actually tell you if it's a link you have followed before or not. So that's just in the structure of the link itself. The important thing for us in PowerPoint is to make that link text descriptive. So I'm going to go back to where I was. Sorry about that. I disoriented myself. So I just want to make a couple of points as we near the end of our time together here about audio and video. There are, and those of you who have tried to play, especially video before in a conference setting, when you go in and maybe you're using your computer, maybe you're not, you don't know how good the Wi-Fi is. You may be in the habit of having your videos outside of your slides one way or the other, or they might be on your computer and streaming through PowerPoint. I have a note here where I suggest it's best to put them online outside of the slides. And there are a lot of variables there. I say that because sometimes putting things out on YouTube makes it easier for you to make sure that the captions are embedded and that a player is actually pretty accessible. And what I mean when I say the player, the piece that the video is actually embedded in, it's important to make sure that that is accessible as well. It's important to be sure that somebody can use all the controls from a keyboard, that a screen reader will announce what the controls are, and so on and so forth. Anymore, I think PowerPoint support is stronger with the embedded videos. I will say most of the time I see folks stream videos through YouTube. And that's where these next couple of pieces are still really relevant. Let's say, though, that you have just an audio track, right? So you just have somebody speaking, you have whatever it is that's audio only, there's no visual. You need to be sure in that case that you have a transcript for the audio available. A transcript is just the words, and if you have multiple speakers, then it'll have speaker identification. But in its purest form, a transcript really just captures spoken words. And it does need to be exact, needs to be precise. And there's a lot of information out there about multimedia accessibility. These are just some quick hits for you. If you have video, which I think is more common in PowerPoint presentations and presentations in general, then you need a caption track. And a caption basically is a transcript with timing information to be sure that the words show up at the right time. Again, if you are pretty experienced giving presentations or teaching, you've probably noticed that if people have captions to read, they're going to read them. So whether they need them or not, because they might not be able to hear, captions are super helpful for your audience. For those of you that do conference talks and such, you can't control the audio in a room. Rooms often have places where there's an odd echo or kind of a silent spot where the sound just doesn't travel. Maybe you get there and they don't have house sound. In other words, you can't pipe the audio from your computer over speakers in the room. So all of these are really good justification for captioning just in general. It's still a requirement for digital stuff. And so with your videos, if they're in YouTube, be sure that they're captioned. And I want to make a quick point about YouTube's automatic captioning, which is, it's a good place to start. You need to go in and edit and make sure that it's accurate. And most videos for presentations that I've seen are short. You know, we're talking about 5-minute videos, maybe 10, 15. And in that situation, they're probably not outrageously difficult to do the captioning yourself if you need to, but it is something that you need to do with your video in your presentations. I could literally do an hour just on multimedia. I'm just going to leave it at that as a consideration for you. A couple of other tips: be careful using transitions and animations in your slides. Folks that have photosensitivity, that have epilepsy or something similar, the flashing or those quick slide transitions where slides look like they're spinning and coming into view or spinning and going away, at worst those can cause a seizure for somebody. At best they can be really distracting. The accessibility guidelines and standards that we have now aren't outrageously specific about what flashing means or how to measure it, especially with the transitions and some animations that you might see. So it's difficult to give you a tool that will measure this precisely. But just keep it in mind when you have anything that flashes, anything that, even with a spinning action or some of those slide transitions that are really fast, you can literally cause a seizure, which of course none of us wants to do. The second tip, and I alluded to this before, is you can use the speaker notes in PowerPoint to convey more information. So the speaker notes are there for those of us that do stuff like this to help keep us on track. If it's something where we just want to make sure we keep things in order, we have a couple of notes about extra details we don't want to skip, but we don't want to put them on the slides, then we can put them there. Like I said before, the speaker notes in the PowerPoint format are accessible, and they're really helpful if you want to add extra information, again, especially about a visual or something like that. Microsoft has, I think since Office 2010, had an accessibility checker that's really, really helpful. In 2019, it's more mature than it was before. I'll show it to you here in just a sec because I want to show you that color contrast issue that we had before and show you what a fail looks like. In PowerPoint, it also checks for things like reading order. It will let you know that there is content missing. It'll let you know if there's alternative text missing. There are some things it can't check for, so I wouldn't rely on it completely, especially as you're just kind of entering into bringing more accessibility into your slides. But it's still an incredibly helpful tool. To get to the accessibility checker, you go over into the File tab. Visibly, it's the farthest left of the tabs up in the ribbon. This is where you go to save a file, for example. And in the info group section here, which is just in the middle, I have a button. It's the middle of these three as they go up and down. And the button is labeled check for issues. And I'm going to click on that. And the second option says check accessibility. So this will fire off the accessibility checker. And it's going to give me just a couple of errors. So the first one, it picks on me about missing slide titles on a few of my slides. It's these slides that I've added for demonstration. I didn't put a title in, but this is a helpful reminder that, hey, you're missing a slide title here. This is, again, new to Office 2019. This next one says Intelligent Services, and it mentions suggested alternative text. I think that's handy if this option is on in your version of Office, because it should tell you every time it tries to create alternative text. And the nice thing about any of these is that when I open up the error, it shows me each instance of the error. So with missing slide title, it shows me that slides 7, 8, and 9 don't have a slide title. And if I click on slide 7, for example, I can come in here and type a title. And as soon as I type a letter, it clears it out of the error. So it's checking as I go in and fix these things as well. The alternative text that it came up with is the last chart that I put in. And the alternative text, when I click on the content placeholder in this accessibility report, it highlights it in the slide. So it takes me to the slide and it highlights it. And it shows me the alternative text. So this alternative text is for a chart. It's for that 3 series chart with the markers on the lines. The alternative text that Microsoft came up with is a picture containing light, which just reinforces that you really can't trust it yet. What I thought it would catch that it did not is the color contrast here, because I thought that it would pick up on color contrast, and either I'm wrong or it overlooked it. I'm going to bet that I overlooked something. But the checker, again, not comprehensive, still really helpful. It gives you information down at the bottom that says, why should I fix this particular error? And it takes you through the steps to actually fix each one as well. The last point that I want to make, because I know a lot of us publish stuff as PDF out of Office, and this tip is true for Word or PowerPoint, but you can save this file in a way that makes an accessible PDF. I think a lot of us were first taught to create a PDF from Office by using print to PDF, and that sends text over but nothing else. So the alternative text, the importance of titles, there are so many structural elements that are hugely important for accessibility. They get lost when you do that, that you need to shift over to saving the file as a PDF. So if you have Microsoft Office, you can go into the File menu, do a Save As, just like you're probably really comfortable and familiar doing, and down in the File Type drop-down box, look for PDF. And I'll show that real quickly. I'm going to go into the File tab. I'm going to select Save As. And when I get my Save As box open, I've got file name, and the label is actually Save As type. And this drop down has a whole bunch of stuff, including PDF. So I would, if I want an accessible PDF from this PowerPoint, I would select PDF and say Save. Now, the accuracy and the quality of accessibility in that process is a whole lot better in later versions of Office. If you're on 2010 or older, it's going to break a bunch of stuff. If you're on 2013 and 2016, it's better. And on 2019, it's that much better still. So really the best way to do this, unless you have Acrobat Pro. And if you do have Acrobat Pro, then you'll have a tab up in the ribbon that's labeled Acrobat. And if you select that and you look over to the far left, it's the first option in the ribbon is Create PDF. So you can use that to create your PDF as well. Yeah, Dana, yes, Dana, somebody had asked about the Acrobat tab. The difference here is that if you do File Save As, then Microsoft is creating the PDF. If you have Acrobat Pro installed and you have this option, it's actually Acrobat handling the conversion. It tends to be a little bit better. Microsoft has closed the gap, again, with the later, greater versions of Office. So a couple of quick things about delivery, and then I will let you all get on with your day. First and foremost, if you're in a room with a mic and it works, please use it. Your voice probably carries. My voice does legitimately carry, except for that weird silent spot in the room, or that weird place, or that place with the weird echo. If you're in a room and it has a microphone, use it. At the very least, it'll keep you from shouting to help your voice carry to all of those little nooks and crannies. But when you're actually delivering your content, please use a mic if it's there. Not every event has a microphone, okay. But if it's there, then it's really, really helpful. If you accept questions from the audience and there's no microphone for them, it's a really good idea to repeat those questions, because I can guarantee you that not everyone hears every question from the audience. If there is a mic and you have somebody to run a microphone into the audience, great, because then there's no translation, there's no kind of paraphrasing people's questions. But it's a really good idea without that microphone for the audience to repeat questions. And then finally, and I've tried to do this myself, describe your visuals. Not everybody's going to be able to see your images super clearly. So it's always a good idea to describe those visuals, whether someone is blind or not. You can talk through them. It typically doesn't take a ton of time. And you can also build that into your narrative during your training or your talk to maybe replace some text points or to add to those text points by being willful about how you describe the visual. Really, really helpful, because a lot of people, again, might not be blind, just really can't see. So I've got resources and I've got a question I want to come back to. I'm a couple minutes over, so Nicole, I will address your question here in just a moment. The resources, I'm going to hop out of here so I can copy and paste these. And this may look a little bit sloppy in the Zoom chat. Oh, they didn't actually copy. So these resources, again, I think are super helpful. The nice thing to me about the Microsoft link in particular is that it stays really up to date. So as Microsoft comes out with new versions of Office 2019, as they update things, that page stays up to date. And it also has information on previous versions. So for those of you who are on 2016, 2013, even 2010, you should still do everything you can to make the file accessible. And when you go to that Microsoft resource, you can select the version that you're on, and you can even select Mac or PC versions. So really, really helpful resources there. Real quickly, there was a question. Showing an old news. So Nicole says, showing an old newspaper clipping, the title and picture were important. I was told all text needed to be conveyed in closed caption. So anything spoken should be in your closed captions. When you have meaningful visual information, that should be described audibly. So you have two different audiences that benefit the most from this. Closed captioning is going to be for folks that can't hear the audio. And so in that case, if someone can see but not hear, then they need to have the important audio information in the caption track, which generally is going to be the spoken words, but you'll have things in captions like music cues if the musical lyrics are important. then that may be in the closed captions. When you have a visual that's important, that's going to be something called audio description, which is beyond the scope, and we're a little long on time anyway, but it's beyond the scope of this particular presentation, but that's what you're looking for. When you have important visible elements, there's something called audio description that needs to address those. You can search closed caption and or audio description in your search engine of choice and find quite a bit of information about it. So not as thorough of an answer, but you can get a hold of me through the AT3 Center, and we can get an answer to you. But yeah, for now, Nicole, I'll just send you to Google a couple of things, or Bing, or whichever search engine you prefer. Without any other questions, or even if you have some, type them into the chat. We'll try to get to them. If I didn't answer one, then let me know and let us know in the chat that we missed it. I otherwise just want to thank you all so much for dedicating a chunk of your day to us. We have recorded this, and you all will receive an email when that recording is available online. We really do appreciate the time, really appreciate you working to make the digital space more accessible. Hugely important work. A lot of us contribute to it. So, really, truly thank you so much for your time and dedication to this. Quick reminder that we do have another 4 parts coming in this series, an extension of the series where we'll get into PDF content. Lissa will be taking that. Those start late next month, late March. And the registration information, I believe, is up on the AT3 Center website. And if it is not, then somebody will probably email it to you, because we want to make sure that people know that these are rolling out. So again, thank you so much. Have a fantastic day, and hopefully we will cross paths sometime again in the future. Have a great one.